Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the famous Sherlock Holmes series of stories. The character of Sherlock Holmes was hyper-rationalist. He clearly understood reasoning and critical thinking, and yet Arthur Conan Doyle himself was deeply into spiritualism. He firmly believed in the spiritual mediums of his day. In fact, this eventually led him into conflict with originally his dear friend, the famous magician Houdini. Houdini was a rationalist, and he made a career out of debunking the spiritualist mediums of his day because he knew that they were using the same escapist techniques that he would use on stage to entertain. Doyle and Houdini came to blows over this, and that ended their friendship. Doyle also was famously taken in by what we now know as the Cottingley Fairies. Two girls, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, claimed that they were being visited by little winged fairies in their garden at Cottingley Village, and they provided photographs as proof of this visitation. In the end, it was easily demonstrated that their photographs were of them posing with paper cutouts that they literally cut out of books and then propped up on sticks. That was the evidence, that literally flimsy evidence that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, completely fell for. It's a great story, and it leads to the question of why. How is it possible that the author of Holmes could have fallen for a literal childish hoax? And that's what we're going to be exploring in this lecture. Our brains are belief machines. We are motivated to believe. We are born to believe, especially those things that we want to believe. And what we will be exploring in this lecture is what drives this human desire for belief and what drives the specific things that we tend to believe in. The hope is that by understanding what motivates us, understanding what makes us tick, as it were, that we will be able to transcend or at least mitigate the influence of those motivations. In fact, we might say that the default mode of human psychology, a term frequently used to mean the pathway of least resistance, default mode meaning the way we will tend to think unless we make a specific effort to act a different way. The default mode is to arrive at beliefs for largely emotional reasons, and then to employ our reason more to justify those beliefs than to modify or arrive at those beliefs in the first place. Therefore, in many ways, we are slaves to our own emotions. That is, if we let ourselves be. It is helpful to try to understand this interaction between beliefs and motivations and reason in the context of neuroanatomy, of understanding the way our brains are organized. In a very meaningful evolutionary sense, our brains are literally a lizard brain inside of a mammal brain, inside of a primate brain, inside of a human brain. The most recently evolved parts of our brain, the neocortex or the frontal lobes, hierarchically can modify and control the earlier evolved, more primitive parts of our brain, all the way down to just our brain stem, the most primitive functions of all, just like breathing and doing very basic things, maintaining balance while we walk. And then we have more sophisticated, more highly evolved emotions on top of that, and then eventually our more advanced reasoning hierarchically on top of that. Much of our cognition, however, takes place subconsciously in the more primitive parts of our brain. And that is where the emotions take place. Emotions essentially make quick decisions for us that are mostly adaptive. They include things like fear, lust, hunger, anxiety, disgust, happiness, and sadness. They are evolved adaptive strategies. The thinking is that emotions provide an evolutionary calculus. They provide us with a very direct behavioral motivation. It is easier and more reliable, for example, to simply make us feel disgust at certain kinds of things, at certain chemicals that give off a certain odor, for example, or the way certain things look. For example, if food looks as if it's rotting, that will make us feel disgust, rather than to have us calculate the risks of eating a certain food. Or, for example, if we are confronted with a danger like a predator, we don't have to calculate the risks of encountering that predator or fleeing. We simply experience the emotion of fear, and then we act upon that emotion. Psychologist Abraham Harold Maslow made an attempt, perhaps the first attempt, to classify the different emotional needs that people have, known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in addition to the very basic emotions that I described, we also have a set of higher psychological needs that we seek. We desire to be safe, to be loved, to have self-esteem, and to experience what Maslow called self-actualization. There is some reflection in our neuroanatomy. As I said, there is a hierarchy from our more evolved parts of our brain to the more primitive parts of our brain, which will enact the more basic needs. The lizard brain can experience hunger, but only our much more evolved neocortex can experience something as the need for self-actualization. It's probably true, and the current psychological thinking is that Maslow's hierarchy is not a literal hierarchy where you have to meet one need before you can meet a need at a higher hierarchical level. But it does reflect, I think, a reasonable categorization of the different kinds of needs that people have. We do know that when we meet our psychological needs, our brain gives us a reward. It makes us feel good, another emotion. There is a basic punishment and reward system built into the hardwiring of our brain. When we do something that is likely to be disadvantageous evolutionarily, we feel bad about it. And when we do something that is advantageous, we feel good about it. We get a shot of dopamine to our reward centers, and we feel good about the behavior that we just engaged in. So what are these needs? What are the needs that motivate us so much? Well, one such need is the desire for control, or at least to have the illusion or the sense of control. We don't like to feel as if we are victims of a capricious universe or a capricious world, or we are helpless in the face of unseen forces, or even randomness. We like to think that we exert some control over ourselves, over the events that happen to us, and over our environment. One manifestation of this desire for control is belief in superstitions. We tend to develop beliefs that if we engage in a certain activity, it will protect us in some way, or it will enable us to perform better or to succeed. And people really develop these superstitious beliefs. For example, sports stars are famous for superstitious beliefs. They may decide that if they wear a certain shirt, for example, that they will play a better game. This is nothing short of magical thinking, but it gives us the illusion that we can exert some control over otherwise random events. There is a psychological study done by Whitstone et al., where they showed further that feeling lack of control enhances our tendency towards pattern recognition, our tendency to see an illusion of control in random data, which I will discuss more in a future lecture. We also have a desire for simplicity. And this is easy to understand. The simpler things are, the more control we can have over them, and we certainly don't like feeling overwhelmed by our environment, by the tasks that we have before us, by the things that are happening in the world. So we tend to oversimplify the things that we are confronted with. We are motivated to oversimplify. We pigeonhole and we stereotype. It enables us to boil down a very complicated set of data to some simple rule. This can be helpful and adaptive when we understand that the rule is just a schematic. It's an oversimplified representation of a much more complicated reality. But when we actually start to accept our oversimplified versions of reality as if they are reality, that leads to things like bigotry, where we may lump an entire group of people in together and assume that they all share traits rather than understanding all of the diversity and complexity that does exist within even definable groups. Let me give you an analogy from my own profession, and that is as a physician, and that is in making a diagnosis. We may seek the simplest answer to a complex set of signs and symptoms or problems that patients are confronting us with, and that may motivate us to find one answer, to find a single diagnosis that explains everything. However, that's not always the case. It may be that there is a lot of noise in the symptoms that a patient is presenting us with. They may, in fact, have one new condition, but they will also present signs and symptoms that have to do with just what we might call the symptoms of life, the background noise of symptoms that we all experience. And many patients have more than one chronic illness at the same time. So while we seek a simple answer, we may be confronted with a much greater complexity. A good rule of thumb is that reality is always more complicated than you think or that you would like to think. We also have a desire for the universe to have meaning. We want the universe to make sense. We want our lives to have meaning. We want there to be a plan for us. It gives us a sense of purpose, and it gives us a filter, a way of making sense out of all of the complex things that happen in life. Some good, some bad, some we just can't make sense of. But if we think that there's this overarching meaning to our own existence, it does give us this very comforting sense of meaning. We want to believe that things happen for a reason, when the reality is probably closer to the fact that stuff just happens. Related to this is our desire to believe that big effects must have big causes. We don't like to think that there could be a massive consequence to a very innocuous or innocent cause. The JFK assassination is one example of this. Many people still believe to this day that the President JFK was assassinated by some vast conspiracy of a large organization or perhaps forces working within the government, that it couldn't have been done by one person acting alone, the so-called lone nut theory. That just doesn't emotionally sit right with them. How could this one crazed individual by himself do something which had such a massive effect on world events? There had to be an equally big cause, a conspiracy that was equal to the consequences of the President of the United States being assassinated. Yet another need that we have is the need for self-esteem, the need to not only feel good about ourselves, but to feel that the others in our community respect us. This has largely to do with the fact that we are intensely social animals. A lot of our emotions and our thinking are tied up with interfacing with other people in our environment. Not only do we need to get attention from other people and feel loved by other people, but we need to develop very social skills, highly developed social skills. And part of that is looking after our own sense of self-worth and how others in our community look at us. This is often referred to as having an ego. And again, a certain amount of ego is very adaptive, but it also powerfully motivates us to interpret the world in a way that is favorable to our own ego. Psychologists often refer to this as the fundamental attribution error, that we tend to look for external causes to explain our own behavior. And when we do so, we're very kind to ourselves. We're very good at rationalizing away our own behavior in order to protect our own self-esteem. We also do things to avoid social embarrassment or stigma. For example, we may avoid appearing inconsistent. We always want to make our own behavior and our own beliefs seem consistent to others. We also have a very strong resistance to admitting error. We don't like to admit that we're wrong or to admit that we have flaws because that is a threat to our self-esteem and our ego. Let me give you an example, a very sad example, unfortunately, from medicine. There are clinics in China and in other parts of the world who are prematurely offering stem cell therapy for severe medical problems, often neurological problems. In one case, a mother sought this stem cell therapy for her 4-year-old daughter who had severe loss of vision. The daughter was examined by eye doctors, ophthalmologists, before the mother took her to the stem cell clinic, and she was told that this treatment's really not legitimate. These clinics are not science-based. They're probably just taking advantage of desperate patients. But she was motivated to seek any possibility of a treatment for her child, a perfectly reasonable desire. She had paid for the treatment. Her child underwent the stem cell therapy. When she returned to her eye doctors in the United States, they examined her daughter and found that her vision was completely unchanged. All of the objective evidence said that there was no benefit whatsoever to her child's vision. And yet, the mother convinced herself that her daughter was seeing better, that she had improved vision. She used whatever confirmation bias and biased perception that she could in order to convince herself that her decision was not a mistake, that she had not subjected her daughter to an unnecessary treatment, perhaps even dangerous treatment, and wasted a lot of resources going against the advice of her physicians. Her motivation to believe that her daughter was helped motivated her to believe that she could see even when the objective evidence was that she couldn't. Another example from fairly recently, in May of 2011, Harold Camping, a self-professed preacher and prophet, predicted that the rapture would come, that his followers would be saved, while those who were not a follower of his particular brand of Christian belief would be met with a literal hell on earth. On May 21st, this divine judgment did not come. Nothing happened. Initially, his followers were perplexed. They couldn't understand how the very careful predictions of Harold Camping, which he justified with some elaborate analysis of biblical phrases, they couldn't understand how it could not come true. But then they hit upon their rationalization. Harold Camping argued that the judgment, in fact, did occur, that it was just a spiritual judgment, not a physical judgment. Therefore, there is absolutely no outward manifestation that the judgment occurred, no evidence. Therefore, he and his followers were enabled to maintain their belief in the face of pretty dramatic negative evidence. This is not an isolated incident. This is, in fact, what typically happens when prophecies fail. When prophecies fail, the believers, in fact, are strengthened in their belief in the prophet and in the prophecy. They find some way to rationalize away the failure, and they dig their heels in, and they are motivated to believe even more strongly. This, again, partly stems from the need to appear consistent, which is related to the need for social esteem. We try to avoid appearing as if we conflict with ourselves. In fact, salesmen may exploit this human need to appear consistent in order to persuade you to buy something that perhaps you don't really need. They might say something, for example, would you say that this would be a useful product to buy? Or could you find a use for this product? If you agree with that, then you appear to be supporting the value of it. And if you then say, yes, that would be valuable, but I still don't want to buy it, that would make you feel inconsistent, and therefore you try to avoid that. They also do something which is called getting the buyer down to the final objection. They, in essence, get you to say that you would buy their product if it were not for this one thing, this one problem that stands in your way. They then eliminate that last objection. Therefore, you have no further reason to defend your decision not to buy the product. If you now still refuse to buy it, you will appear inconsistent, and people will buy the product rather than risk appearing inconsistent to the salesperson. A lot of how these motivations affect our thoughts and behavior can be explained with a concept known as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance theory has been a very successful theory throughout the last decades of psychological thought and research. It's turned out to be a very helpful, robust model. Essentially what this means is that when we have two beliefs in our head at the same time that are mutually exclusive or that conflict with each other, that causes the emotional experience of cognitive dissonance. We don't like that feeling. It motivates us to resolve the conflict. Now, initially, we may avoid cognitive dissonance through compartmentalization. We just keep conflicting beliefs separate from each other. But when they are forced into conflict, we need to resolve that conflict somehow. An adaptive way to resolve the conflict is to update one or both beliefs. If they are in conflict, one or both must be in error in some way. And if we find and correct the error, that can resolve the dissonance. But what we tend to do is to simply rationalize away the belief that we want to hold. Our belief conflicts with reality because there's a conspiracy, because, well, it happened, but just in a way that's not evident. We engage in what a logical process we call special pleading, where we invent reasons to resolve the apparent conflict between different beliefs. Humans are, in fact, very good at inventing reasons to justify our beliefs. Let's also look at morality. One of our emotions, if you will, is a sense of justice. That is something that is hardwired into our brains. It's not a learned sense. We have an innate sense of justice. In fact, animals in the animal kingdom have also been shown experimentally to have an innate sense of justice. For example, there is a species of bird that defend each other from predators. When one bird sees a predator enter an area, they will give off an alarm, and then they will come to the defense of their territory. And by flocking together and defending their territory together, the many smaller birds can fend off a larger predator. If, however, one of the birds in the community, in the area, does not come to the defensive call of other birds, when they give a defensive call, those birds will not reciprocate. They will not defend that bird. These birds seem to have an innate sense of reciprocity, of justice, if you will. Let's discuss a classic moral dilemma to see how we have an innate hardwiring in terms of how we think about morality and justice. Let's say that there is a train switch. This is the so-called train switch example that can divert a train from one track to another. On one track, there is one person, and that's the track that the train is currently heading down. On the adjacent track, there are 5 people. Now, most people would say, well, one person versus 5 people, you would much rather have just one person die than 5 people die. However, let's say the train is going towards the 5 people. Would you flip the switch to divert the train so that it kills only one person than 5 people? You still will be responsible in a way for that one person's death, but you will save 5 people. Most people will do that. They will save the 5. They will switch the tracks, actively killing that one person in order to save 5 people. If you alter the context a little bit and you say, okay, different scenario, there's 5 people on the track. Again, the contrived situation of this moral dilemma is they don't see the train coming. There's no way to get them off the track. You're on the front of the train standing next to another person. If you throw that person off the train onto the tracks in front of the train, that will trigger the brakes of the train will brake and save those 5 people. Will you throw that person onto the track in order to save those 5 people. Most people won't do that. They will switch the tracks from 5 people to 1 person, but they won't throw somebody onto the tracks in order to save 5 people. Now, the cold calculus is the same. You're sacrificing 1 person in both cases in order to save 5 people. But something feels different to us about that situation. The throwing the person on the tracks is just too much of an active, direct cause of their death, and we're emotionally unwilling to do that, when the more passive approach of just switching the tracks, which will cause, downstream the train to hit that 1 person, we were able to overcome that by not throwing the person on the tracks. There's no real rational reason for that. That is simply derives from our evolved emotional sense of what's right and what's wrong. Here's another example. This comes from the book Supersense by a colleague of mine, Bruce Hood, who is a psychologist. He has an example that he often uses on lectures where he says, would you wear a cardigan sweater that was once worn by a famous serial killer? He, in fact, will offer people $20 to just wear a sweater that is, the sweater's been dry cleaned, it's 100% perfectly clean, there is no blood or anything else on the sweater. It's just a sweater that happened to have been worn by a famous serial killer. Many people will not wear the sweater. Perhaps you could think for yourself, would you feel comfortable putting on this sweater? Why is this? Why would it's just wool or cotton or whatever it's made of. It can't possibly harm us. But we have a sense of disgust. Our emotion of disgust gets triggered by this. And this is tied to another sense that is inherent in humans, and that is the sense of essence. The notion that inanimate objects can carry the essence of their history. There's something different about that cardigan sweater because at one point in its past it was worn by a serial killer. It's spiritually contaminated in some way. Again, when we explore this belief, it doesn't really make sense, but it just doesn't feel right to us. In fact, most cultures have a concept of spirituality. This innate sense of essence goes beyond just inanimate objects, and we think that there is a spiritual force, whether it's called animus, chi, or prana. This life force separates us from things that are non-living. In fact, we tend to categorize in our brains living from non-living things. We process information about living things differently than non-living things. Specifically, living things are processed through the emotional centers of our brain. We imbue meaning and feeling to things that we think are alive in ways that we don't do neurologically to things like a rock that are inanimate. Although the division is not exactly between living and non-living things, it's between things that we think of as having agency and things that we think of as not having agency. By agency, we mean it acts as if it has a will of its own. It acts as if it is acting on its own. So if a branch is blowing in the breeze, we rationally know that that is an inanimate object. It's not. The tree's alive, but it's acting just passively in the wind. But if it's moving and it's making noise, we may instinctively think, oh, maybe that may be a predator, maybe something that is acting on its own will, something with agency. This, for example, is why we so easily imbue meaning and emotions onto, for example, cartoon characters. We can be emotionally moved by a two-dimensional cartoon character because it's acting as if it is a person, as if it has agency, and that triggers all of the emotional hardwiring in our brains. We also have a sense of the supernatural, the belief that there is more to the world than what is immediately apparent. This ties back further to our need for a sense of connection, a need for there to be meaning, a need for the profound. When we have a sense that we are connected to something that is profound, it feels good to us in some way. This can then be reinforced by confirmation bias, by sifting through data and looking for the data that seems to confirm our beliefs, which we'll talk about more in a future lecture on biases. This all affects our behavior, the way, obviously, our motivations and our emotions. And in fact, we have looked for ways, psychologists, to influence people's behavior. There are many very practical reasons why we might want to do this. Public service campaigns, for example. We want people to not drive drunk, for example. So how do we do that? Our initial instinct is to give people information, assuming that they will arrive through reason at the correct decision and the correct behavior. But research has shown that this is not very effective. It's very difficult to change people's behavior just by making a rational argument to them. Their behavior is still overwhelmed by their beliefs. It's overwhelmed by their emotions. The scared straight so-called approach is very minimally effective. However, if you address the individual's emotions, that is much more effective. It's still difficult to get people to change old habits. But if you convince them that, for example, by using social pressures, and this utilizes a technique called social norming, if you tell people, you know, other people don't drink and drive, that will have more of an impact on your behavior than telling you the reasons why you shouldn't drink and drive. I like to use children as an example. If you're a parent, or if you have nieces or nephews, or in some way spend time around young children, it's obvious that they are very socially inept. Their brains have not fully developed, specifically their frontal lobes, the most evolved, hierarchically highest part of the brain that it gives us our ability to socialize. Specifically to plan our activity and to think about how our behavior will be perceived by others and by the public. Children have not fully developed that part of their brain. So they have a lot of the same basic motivations and emotions that adults do, but they don't have this social filter that we have in place, and therefore their motives are much more transparent. So they're an excellent window into human emotions and motivations because they're not good at hiding them. Adults are better at hiding our emotions, at our motivations. We're better at rationalizing what we want to believe, and we're better at putting a socially acceptable spin on our behavior. Again, the underlying psychological motivations, however, are largely the same. We do legitimately mature as we get older, but our same basic needs are all still there. Ironically, highly intelligent people may not necessarily be better at making decisions, but they are better at rationalizing the decisions that they do make. Psychologists now recognize a separate skill set called emotional intelligence. Being a rational, logical, and intelligent person isn't enough if you don't also combine that with the skill set of emotional intelligence. This is understanding the relationship between our motivations and our decisions, the tendency to relieve cognitive dissonance with rationalization. And when we understand these things and understand the emotional basis of our motivations, then we can transcend what I like to call our monkey brains and act on a more transcendent, a more critical thinking level of decision-making and behavior. Essentially, neuroanatomically what we're doing is we are using our frontal lobes to make good decisions rather than just rationalize bad decisions or rationalize the primitive decisions that our emotions want us to make. Getting back to Arthur Conan Doyle, again, a fascinating, now almost iconic story of a person who was able to understand rationality well enough to craft the character of Sherlock Holmes, who was certainly a rational, critical thinking character. And yet he chose superstition and fantasy over reason and science. Perhaps if he understood his own motivations better, had developed his own emotional intelligence better, he would have been a little bit more like his own character of Sherlock Holmes, and he wouldn't have fallen for the Cottingley Fairy or the spiritualist mediums of his day who were using essentially simple parlor tricks to fool the public. We all live with this illusion that we are rational beings. We like to believe that we are rational. Again, that's part of our self-esteem. The truth, however, is far more complicated than that.